When employees can go to work and know that they're contributing to making the world better, it creates an unstoppable workforce.
Working towards a higher purpose has always been important for Rose Marcario. So much so that she quit her private equity career to study Buddhist meditation in India for 2 years. She was then drawn to the outdoor clothing company Patagonia, thanks to its strong record on environmental activism. And under her leadership, it thrived.
You know, when I was CEO of Patagonia, it was the most prosperous time in the company's 46-year history. And it was also the most activist time in the company's history. And I think that just proves the case that you can do good and do well.
The election of Donald Trump in 2016 presented a threat to the company's values.
We knew that a lot of the environmental causes that we had championed over, and our founders had championed over, 40 years, were going to be under threat and under attack.
But Marcario kept up the fight, even suing the administration over the protection of public land. Rose left Patagonia last year, but still continues her activism and has this message for business leaders in 2021.
I think that the new customers want business to have a voice and want business to use their voice on the most pressing issues of our day. And I think to the extent that as a business leader you remain quiet or you remain on the sidelines, you are not going to please your customers, and you're not going to please your employees, because we're in a dire situation right now with climate change, and we need action.
Joining me on this Leaders with LACWA Goes Green is former Patagonia Chief Executive Rose Marcario. Rose Marcario, thank you so much for joining us on Leaders with LACWA Goes Green. Now, you were really one of the first ones. You've been an advocate for climate change and sustainability for as long as I can remember. When did you start thinking, actually, this is something that you wanted to do and this was a real passion?
Well, I was CFO of a public tech company in Silicon Valley, sort of infamous company called General Magic. And I started feeling like the work that I was doing in my everyday life wasn't really connected to causes and things I cared about. And then in 2006, I was in New York with a friend who took me to see An Inconvenient Truth. And it caused me to consider the plight of the planet and the impact that the climate crisis was having on humanity and business. And all those things sort of conspired together to bring me to the door of Patagonia, which is a company with a very long history of environmental protection and responsible business. And I spent the last 12 years of my career there, and the last 7 as CEO.
Did you at the time say, right, I want to make a difference and want to work for a company that does good, or I want to work in retail and change the way they think?
Well, I think it's both of those things. I wanted to work for a company that exemplified being a responsible company, because I felt that responsible business was the most important framework going forward if we were going to have a planet that was going to make it, and if we were going to have a world that we wanted to live in.
What was the hardest thing about finding that job?
Well, there are actually a lot of good companies out there right now that are doing the right thing. For me, it was just finding a company that was committed to environmental protection, which was important to me when I was looking at what were the real crises that were facing business, and would ultimately have a big impact on business. As David Brower famously said, there's no business to be done on a dead planet. And when I became CEO, I felt like I should do more. The company had already done a lot, but I felt like we should step up and do more because the urgency of the crisis demanded it. And we became more of an activist company. We began advocating and advancing environmental policies, not just in the US, but everywhere where we had operations around the globe. Putting pressure on politicians and policymakers to act on climate. We see the Trump administration over a 3 million acre reduction of public lands, and we started a regenerative food company focused on sequestering more carbon in in the agricultural process and combating a lot of the damage that's been done by chemical and industrial agriculture.
Yeah, and it ended up also with Patagonia, I think, suing President Trump. At any time, was it bad for sales? And actually, did you care about that? Was it ever actually, if I do this, I may get a hit, but it's the right thing to do? Or was it always associated with what the company should do?
Well, it was always associated with what the company should do and what was the right thing to do in the moment. That also proved to be incredibly good for business. I mean, we had one of the best years we ever had, the year we sued the Trump administration. So I think that the new customers want business to have a voice and want business to use their voice on the most pressing issues of our day. And I think to the extent that as a business leader, you remain quiet or you remain on the sidelines, you're not going to please your customers and you're not going to please your employees, because we're in a dire situation right now with climate change and we need action.
Do you think we're getting enough action? I mean, skeptics, say that actually a lot of businesses are greedy and fundamentally evil and just think about money, but now they're changing because they're being forced to change.
Well, there's some of that. I mean, I think companies are being forced to change. And I think a lot of that has to do with activist pressure. I think it has to do with pressure from customers, pressure in some cases from their employees. And I think that they realize that, anyone who's in business realizes that your supply chains are being impacted by extreme weather. Also, you look at COVID, I mean, that's had a huge impact. The climate crisis, the health crisis, the racial justice crisis, they're all kind of interrelated and intercausal in a lot of ways. And I think companies that, want to sidestep that or greenwash or ignore the reality, I don't think they're going to be successful brands. I don't think they're going to be the brands that will be on people's lips in the next 20 years.
Rose, how many calls do you get from chief executives or chairwomen and chairmen saying, look, I want to do the right thing. I want to have a voice, but I'm scared about my revenues. I'm scared about my business and sales.
I think that fear of reprisal or fear of action is a topic that comes up. It's less about what the customers will think than what their board or investors will think. And I think the hardest group we've had to convert is the investor class. And that's changing now, as we've seen with, some of the proclamations that have come out. The EU is doing this new financial disclosure requirement, which I think will be really help with the baseline measurement of how we measure ESG. I think the greenwashers won't have anywhere to hide anymore because we'll get better at measuring and we'll get better at building a corporate governance structure that includes ESG.
Up next, Rose Marcario on the future of meat production, healing the environmental damage that's been done, and what positives can be taken away from the pandemic.
I think we've learned a lot with COVID that we don't need to get on a plane and travel 5 hours to get to a business meeting, a 2-hour business meeting somewhere and fly back.
Big problems require big solutions, and climate change is as huge a challenge as there is. That's why for former Patagonia chief executive Rose Marcario, it's all about scale when she's looking at companies that can make a difference. We continue our conversation on this episode of Leaders with Lacroix Goes Green. Have you ever been tempted, right, since you've left Patagonia, to just take over a big company and look at the supply chains and try and actually try and fix, from almost from scratch what they're doing?
Well, I think I have been tempted, but I will say that it's much harder in a company that's been entrenched in the status quo, especially a public company, to go in and make that kind of change. Although there are people that are doing that and they're doing it well and honorably. I think I'm more interested now in transformation at scale at our transportation and energy and industrial and agricultural systems. And I think we'll get some of that transformation with existing companies, and then we'll get some of that transformation with new companies that are first principles based, that are starting with a clean sheet of paper and saying, how do we heal the damage that's been done? And what kind of products and services can we create to do that?
So what industries do you think that's through? I know you're on 2 boards. How do you choose actually the boards you sit on?
Well, for me, what I've said is sort of my criteria is they have to be first principles based. They have to have the potential to scale, because I think being able to scale is very important, because we need change, relatively quickly. I'm on the board of Rivian, which is an electric transportation company, and I'm on the board of a plant-based protein company that's using a very natural fermentation process to create protein. And the food system requires a lot of transformation when you look at climate action. And there will be some companies that will, I think, win the day. And I think I'm betting on those companies that will be the best for the environment, use the most natural processes, and use organic inputs into their processes.
I mean, if you had to choose, and I know it's difficult, but if you look at the priorities that we need to focus on, is it eat less meat, or is it, try and travel in a less polluting way?
Well, it's funny. I think we've learned a lot with COVID that we don't need to get on a plane and travel 5 hours to get to a business meeting, a 2-hour business meeting somewhere, and fly back. I mean, I think we've learned a lot about our footprint. We've learned a lot about how to use digital technology. And I think that's been a positive outcome. On the issue of eating meat or not eating meat, the reality is we have to feed 10 billion people or something by 2050. If we do it the way we're doing it now with industrialized agriculture and chemical agriculture, we'll blow out every planetary boundary that's there. So we need a transformation there. We need affordable protein. I think we need grazing animals on the biome, though. It's just they have to be, not in an industrial system that we have now. So I think we'll see a lot of transformation in agriculture over the next, 10 to 20 years. And I think it's an exciting area.
You have a very strong set of values and of principles. Who instilled that in you?
I think in general, our family is an Italian immigrant family. My grandparents are Italian immigrants. I think that our entire family has a very strong sense of justice. We're all fighters for things that are good and right and just and fair. And so I think I probably got it from my immigrant family.
I mean, what kind of advice did you give to employees? Again, is it, actually, is it all about the fighting spirit in what you believe in?
Well, I think that, employees recognize, I think one of the things that CEOs that are sort of hesitant about this work maybe don't appreciate is how much employees working for a purpose that's greater than themselves, especially an issue like climate that's just so pressing and so obvious with extreme weather and everything that we've been through. There's been at least a few fires, significant fires, where when I was CEO, and I saw the impact of that on my employees. And when employees can go to work and know that they're contributing to making the world better, it creates an unstoppable workforce. I mean, something that gets lost in the plot sometimes of all this conversation is that, when I was CEO of Patagonia, it was the most prosperous time in the company's 46-year history.
Up next, fighting fake news. It's a challenge environmental activists constantly face these days. And for Marcario, the platforms that help spread it hold much of the blame.
They all fail. They get an F. They get a failing grade, and it's sad and it's bad for our democracy.
It's not just CO2 emissions and deforestation that modern-day environmentalists find themselves battling. Now there's misinformation and fake news to contend with too. And as far as former Patagonia chief executive Rose Marcario is concerned, the social media companies that help spread it have a lot to answer for. We discussed the importance of objective truth and the fight against propaganda. Would you hire a climate change denier?
I don't think a climate change denier would come to work at Patagonia. I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things around hiring too is hire. Getting alignment on values. It's almost more important than skills, right? Is to have people that share your values and that care about the issues that you care about. In your work.
What do you worry about? Do you worry about fake news? I guess we all worry about fake news, but is this one of the most pressing issues? If you're an advocate, right, for trying to do the good thing and sustainability, fake news is one of the worst things because you're not fighting or talking about facts. Whose responsibility is it to write that?
Well, I worry about objective truth. You can't lose sight of objective truth, and a lot of this fake news and propaganda is undermines objective truth, and so that's very concerning. I think business can play a role in that, and all the polarization that we're seeing, by kind of trying to cool that off, because business is very good at facts and real impacts and measurement and goals, and I think that can help in this situation. And also, I think businesses need to look at who they're supporting politically. Are they supporting climate deniers? And if they are, then they might consider prioritizing differently because we need to prioritize the planet.
What do you do actually about some of the tech companies, some of the social media companies?
Well, I think the social media companies have failed. They've done a terrible job of managing the problem. They have this attitude of they're not responsible, and yet they are responsible. And I don't think there's any tech company right now that trades in information that I would call a responsible company. I think they all fail. They get an F. They get a failing grade, and it's sad, and it's bad for our democracy.
But if they don't regulate themselves, so whose job would it be to actually make sure that they at least get a pass?
Well, I think the government has to step in and regulate them. You would probably know better all of the things that they need to do to fact check and whatnot. But I feel like they've contributed a lot to what we've seen in terms of the attacks on our democracy, both external and internal, and business has a role to play there. To support democracy. I founded Time to Vote, which is a bipartisan coalition of companies that gives their employees time off to vote, because we make voting so hard in the US. We make it on a Tuesday. It's not a national holiday. And I think we need to be worried about democracy right now and preserving it, because if we don't have a strong democracy, we're not going to have a strong economy.
What role can business play in that?
Like I said, I think business can play a role in kind of cooling down the rhetoric. I also think that business does play a role. I mean, if you're doing business in a state that's actively undermining voting rights, you should be calling up those state politicians and talking to them and letting them know how you feel about that, and that you feel that democracy is an important thing to preserve. I mean, business has an incredibly powerful voice, and we need to step up and use it right now, because this is a critical time on so many levels.
Do you remember of a particularly difficult day in the office, and what you did to overcome it?
Well, I think that a difficult day was the day after the election, because we knew that a lot of the environmental causes that we had championed over, and our founders had championed over 40 years, were going to be under threat and under attack. And that turned out to be true. And so that was a tough day that morning in the office, and the night before I'd written a letter to the company, and I said it might be a tough day, but the reality is it's also our time. It's our time to step up, to do more, to advance and care and advocate for these places in wild nature that don't have a voice. It's our job to become their voice now.
So this was the day after Donald Trump got elected.
Yes.
Do you feel like it actually energized people because they thought they were fighting the good fight?
I do. I mean, I think it gave our work even more meaning and purpose, and it already had a lot of meaning and purpose because of course, all the great work the company had done over the decades. But it definitely amplified it. And when I talk to other CEOs now, they talk about that same kind of urgency and amplification of these issues around the climate crisis now. And they see that same urgency in their employees, and I think that's a good thing. I think that's going to help us get the kind of progress and change we need.
Do you worry that actually that change wanes, or that wanting for change wanes once we get over the pandemic?
No, I think that we're living through a climate emergency right now, and you don't have to look any further than the truth of the data. This last year was the hottest year on record since they started recording the weather in 1850. Just 2020 alone, I think it was $95 billion in the U.S. in the cost of extreme weather, which is like twice the 40-year average. So I think that it's going to be top of mind for everyone. And like I said, a lot of these issues are intercausal and interrelated. So we sort of, the way I look at it is we have to use business as a force for good in the world. And I think it can be that if we put our minds to it, and business can have a huge impact in creating a better world. It can reform its reputation a little bit that you talked about earlier. And the good companies that will scale and do the right thing, electrify our transportation, clean up our food system. I think those companies will be the companies that are the names that we remember in the next 20 years.
Do we need to consume a lot less? So in your utopic world, if like in 5-10 years, how do we live?
Well, I'm not anti-growth in any way. I don't think I believe in capitalism. I love capitalism. I think we learned it during COVID, right? That we can probably consume more stuff that we don't need, right? We learned what was essential for us to have. And I think that's, just anecdotally talking to people, I think it's changed their consumption habits. I think what's important is consuming the things that are high quality, consuming that will last a long time, consuming the food that's grown properly, that's grown well, that's not hurting the environment, but is helping the environment. So, I want companies to grow that are good companies and that are doing the right thing. So I wouldn't just paint, growth or consumption with one broad brush.
Rose, thank you so much for your time.
It was great being with you, Francine.